All right, what's up, guys? So, welcome back to another little segment. I hope you guys got a chance to check out my first three videos, talking a little bit about periodization, kind of the way I use my or kind of my philosophy when it comes to programming for my athletes, and kind of just my thought process when it comes to planning out an off season for an athlete. So now I want to shift gears a little bit. I'm gonna spend some time kind of talking about some smaller topics that I feel like aren't well known about, or aren't or, or things I feel like are underutilized. So the first one that I want to talk about is the A1 A2 um, alternating or antagonistic pairing um, kind of system of training. So this is more regarding single training sessions, and I believe there are other names such as zigzag or alternating sets. So essentially what you're doing is you pair multiple exercises together, and there are rest periods in between each exercise. And what you do is you go through each exercise before restarting, and you complete all the sets for the A series, or a group of exercises, before moving on to the next group. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the pros and the cons. Most of this is based off kind of my experience and kind of how I've used it, how some of the things that I've noticed while using it, and some others. There's a couple little things that I've heard about regarding the system. So the first advantage, and what you'll notice, is that the first two are kind of interlinked, and they're kind of the main reasons why I still include it a little bit in my training and in the training of my athletes. So the first one is training density. By using this sort of system, by pairing normally two exercises together and alternating them, you're able to increase the training density. Now, training density is simply the amount of work done in a period of time. So how much work can you get done in a 1 hour training session? So you notice a lot of people, they spend hours and hours in the gym, but they don't get much work done. That means they have a very low training density. So this way, this alternating kind of style of training allows you to increase your training density and get a lot more work done in a shorter period of time. I don't think many people want to spend 2 hours in the gym every time they go. So, including these here and there can be very economical and very efficient. So I'm not going to kind of explain the chart or the examples on the right too much, but what you'll notice is that you're doing the same exercises, the same reps, same sets, same tempo. But what I've done in the bottom example is I've split the rest time. So what you notice is that in the top, it goes from 2 minutes in between each exercise, and in the bottom, it goes to a minute. But what you should also notice is that in the top, you're doing one exercise at a time. So you do all your sets of dumbbell presses before moving on to your sets of rows. Whereas in the bottom, you're alternating between the two. Now, let's say, for the sake of this example, you use the same weights for both examples. What you'll notice is that the bottom, by alternating exercises, you're able to cut your workout by 8 minutes, or the series by 8 minutes. So instead of doing 24 minutes, you only have to do 16, which allows you to do more work later on. So again, it relates to the efficiency of the training. And the reason why I kind of like to increase the training density is mostly for body composition, for metabolic purposes, and also kind of as a means of training the muscles, and not taxing the nervous system too much, just because you're still limiting somewhat the poundage on the body, and the weights used by alternating. So the second advantage is related somewhat to the first one, in that you're able to kind of increase the load. Let's say, granted that the total training time is equal. So if you're doing straight sets for an exercise, so in the top example, you do 4 sets of 8 dumbbell presses with a 4-1-1 tempo and 2 minutes of rest in between each set. Now, over the first 3 sets, you would accumulate a great level of fatigue, and possibly to get the 8 reps, you have to drop down in weight. But by pairing 2 exercises together, 2 opposing muscle groups specifically, or it could also be like, say, upper and lower, with the same rest periods, same tempo, you're essentially having 4 minutes of rest before hitting that exercise again. So by pairing the exercises and the muscle groups, you're able to increase the amount of recovery between sets, therefore increasing the load, increasing the stimulus placed on the body and the muscles, and therefore increasing or eliciting a greater adaptation. So for the purposes of just body composition, for metabolic purpose, this is a very, very efficient way of getting a lot of work done in a short amount of time. Now, some other pros that I find are not less important, but kind of not the main ones of why I still utilize this system. So the first one is a structural balance purpose. It's a very easy way to kind of balance out your body and the joints. So if you think about it, you could do a push and a pull. You could do quads and hamstrings, or I like to kind of think of it as front and back. So by thinking of this and by pairing 2 antagonistic muscles, you're avoiding the potential of creating an imbalance at a joint. So just for structural purposes, I find it's a very, very efficient style of training. Now, another advantage, and I want to preface this by saying I don't know too much about this one. This is just something that I've heard and that I think is very interesting to think about. But I was listening to a podcast with Cal Dietz, and he was talking about how when he was training his son during the early parts of COVID, what he noticed was after his son would perform a back squat or a set of back squats and then go into his sprint, his mechanics would shift. He would go from being a hip hamstring dominant sprinter to being more of a quad dominant sprinter. Now, he was a little bit confused about this. So he was playing around, and what he noticed was that simply by adding a set of glute ham raises, so something to target the posterior chain, like the hamstrings and glutes, putting that in between the squats and the sprint kind of altered his mechanics and reset his movement patterns back to a hip and hamstring dominant sprinter. Now, he observed the same thing with some of his athletes using force plates. After back squat, they'd be more of a quad dominant jumper versus you include a hamstring movement, they're back to being the hip and hamstring dominant. Now, again, I don't want you to quote me on this. I just think it's something very interesting to think about, and I think it'd be interesting to learn more about and kind of find out the science behind it. Now, some of the disadvantages, the first one being, if you're looking to train for maximal strength, I would not recommend using this alternating series or alternating sets style, simply because when you're chasing maximal strength for a specific exercise, you want to limit as much neurological and muscular fatigue over the whole exercise and the whole session, as well as for in each individual set. So more specifically, let's say you're Chuck Vogelpohl in the picture here. You're going after, it's a max effort day. You're going after a max set of three reps on the squat. I highly doubt you would want to do leg curls in between your sets or your attempts, your squat attempts, just because by doing those hamstring curls, even if they're not to failure, it's still creating muscular fatigue. and the hamstrings are very much involved in the squat. So by fatiguing the hamstrings, you're increasing the likelihood of missing the squat. Now we're chasing after maximal strength. So we're not necessarily looking for muscle, like kind of muscular strength. So if you're fatiguing the muscles, which is limiting your performance in strength, you're going to kind of limit your adaptations and your progress over time. So if you're doing, say, max effort bench press, anything focused on strength, I would not include another exercise with that. Now, a couple other cons. The first one being, generally with deadlifts, they're a very taxing exercise on both the body, on the muscles and the nervous system. So I generally don't pair them with any other exercises. So even if you're doing, let's say, dumbbell presses with deadlifts, there's still a level of mental and neurological fatigue there, as well as muscular. So if you go back to your deadlifts, you won't be as, let's say, recovered to perform the deadlift, which increases the chance of injury. Let's say, if you can't create the tightness or the stiffness in the bottom and you start pulling and your back breaks, or you're not literally, but let's say you lose that tension just because you did a set of abs in between, which is not too taxing. Well, you just kind of wasted the purpose of performing that exercise. Now, a final one, and again, I don't want you to kind of quote me on this. I think this is just something interesting to think about, and something that I don't have any science behind it, but it's something that I've noticed with my own personal training. When I was taking the neurotyping course by Christian Thibodeau, he was talking about how with the style of training, it places a great neurological demand on the brain, just because you're essentially switching or forcing the brain to alternate between two tasks. So by that, I mean, you're making your brain work harder. So your brain has to focus on one exercise, and then during the rest period, it has to completely switch sides and focus on something else. And that constant back and forth is very taxing on the brain. And the way I kind of noticed that was, let's say, I noticed it mostly for my bench press. So normally I would start my bench session with my competition bench. And then after I move on to a secondary movement. Now, let's say for the sake of the example, it's an incline press. Even though all my pressing muscles are warmed up and I've just spent, let's say, the last 20, 30 minutes doing bench press, going over to the incline press, even I have to do warm-ups simply just to get the movement pattern, because it is a different movement, even though it is a pressing movement. So slight variations can make your brain, or makes it, how do I say this? Simply by changing the exercise slightly, it's a completely different movement pattern, and it makes your brain kind of switch gears a little bit. So if you're alternating between two exercises, essentially you're making your brain work harder, as opposed to if you did one single exercise. Now, again, I want to say that, I'm not saying that this system is bad. I'm not saying that it's good. All I'm saying is that there's a time and place to include these. So I do like to use them with machines, or say lower stress movements, just because the machines can kind of put you in a groove. So there's not that, let's say, it's not, you don't have to ingrain the movement pattern as much. It kind of sets you in place. And normally when I'm trying to target muscles, I like to use this just because I don't want to have to wait 2 minutes between bicep curls. So I'm going to give it a little sample here. Very, very basic. For some reason, I always give arm days. I don't know why. I think it's just because they take a training, they think of arms. I don't know too many people that need a full arm day, but just for the sake of this example, you do all the A's, the A1s and A2s together before moving on to the B's. So you do A1, you do your close grip bench press, rest 2 minutes, do your close grip chin up, rest 2 minutes, and you alternate back to the bench press and continue until you've done all the sets, before moving on to the B series, where you do the same thing with the decline dumbbell extensions and the Zotman curls. So I hope you guys enjoy this. If you have any questions, or even if you have any kind of comments, kind of if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, what's your experience? I would love to hear about it. I'm always open for discussion. I will never say that I know everything. There's one thing that I've learned this year is that there's too much to know, and we'll never be able to know everything. So if you have any comments, please send me an email, send me a DM on Instagram. I would love to hear from you and kind of hear your feedback or your experiences. So I really hope to hear from you, and stay tuned for next week's segment. All right, see you guys.